Okay, well, welcome, Quirk students. This is a pre-recorded version of the lecture that I will be giving on Thursday morning. This is kind of our kickoff lecture, and I am doing this both so that I can put this on Canvas in case you want to listen to this again, and also as just a little backup too. So, in case the Wi-Fi goes out, or something weird happens with Zoom. I'm not expecting that, but okay. So this will be the first mammalogy module, and we're going to look at an introduction to the mammals. And so I'm going to give you, in a short period of time, a very quick introduction to the evolution of mammals and a little bit about their unique characteristics and their ability to adapt uh, to environments that is pretty special. So, with that said, I'm going to, and please, uh, when we do this on Zoom, you can ask questions, of course, but don't get too worried if it's a lot of information, because it's a little bit of a fire hose. This is information that normally we would cover over a period of a week. I teach a course in this that is also probably at least a week that we would cover this material. So I'm going pretty fast, but you do have the slides to go back to. Now this is uh, the geologic time scale, and so just so that we can be clear on what's going on here, let's get this laser pointer fired up. We're going from old down here. Uh, 4.6 million years ago. So we're talking about the origin of the Earth, reputedly, going to the first multi-celled organisms, and then kind of the evolutionary history of invertebrates and fishes, the early vertebrates, and then kind of marching through amphibian, reptiles, birds, and mammals up until the present time. So that's what's going on here. So this is really interesting, and it's just fundamentally fascinating to look at the changes that we can infer from the fossil record about mammals in particular. And so, first of all, we have kind of the early pre-mammals called the pelycosaurs. We would probably look at them and say, "Oh, they're dinosaurs," but they're actually on a an evolutionary branch that's moving towards the mammals. And we're talking about here, 200 and you know 50 to 300 million years ago, so a while ago. We then have the therapsids, which are starting to look a little bit more like mammals. We then have archaic mammals, and this is going from about 250 million years ago. And then the placental and marsupial mammals, which are representatives of the most primitive line of extant mammals, those mammals that are still around, at least some of them. And that is around the time of the Cretaceous, about 145 to about 65 million years ago. 65 million years ago is when the dinosaurs proper go extinct. And then subsequently, we have this so called age of mammals, where all the modern clades, orders, families, and genera evolve. And then we end up with our modern day mammals. So just to quickly go through and give you an idea of this evolutionary sequence, because it really is interesting. We have the amniotes, and of course, all mammals are amniotes, meaning that they have an enclosed egg, which doesn't need to be in an aquatic environment in order to develop, like a shell or the internal development. And we have two groups, the synapsida, and that branch leads to mammals. And then we have the diapsida, and that branch leads to reptiles and their fossil relatives. So there's a synapsid skull. That's what we're talking about. Don't get too worried about all this. And the synapsids, basically, as you can see, we start with this kind of the root of the synapsids, and we have one group that goes off to dinosaurs and birds, and another branch here that goes to kind of some of the early pre mammals and mammals proper. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about, going through the synapsid line. And I just have to say sorry for all the different complicated uh, cladograms that we have here, the phylogenetic trees. Um, don't worry too much about this, but what this is showing is that we've got early synapsids going to pelycosaurs, going to therapsids. So there are the pelycosaurs, and this is the base of this section of the tree, meaning it's earlier on. I'll talk about that. We got the therapsids, which is a more recent development. And then we have the mammals proper. So the pelycosaurs, you would look at and you would say these are not mammals; these are dinosaurs. And the pelycosaurs that we'd be most familiar with would be the what some people call the sailbacks, and these are guys like Dimetrodon, the size of a Saint Bernard, so a large dog, and they've got these large neural arches on their back. Um, and that's kind of uh, we're not sure. It was believed to be for thermoregulation or maybe for display. And you've probably seen pictures of this, but other pelycosaurs that did not have those elongated neural spines. So these are just generalized carnivores. So they're eating meat, pelycosaurs. And again, we're talking about not dinosaur size. These are not dinosaurs, but they look a little bit like a big lizard, about the size of a Saint Bernard. And there's actually a picture showing a pelycosaur with the elongated neural spines, just to give you an idea of the actual skeletal features. The other thing that's really interesting about these pelycosaurs is that although it's not, of course, fossilized, because all we really have is the hard parts, meaning the bone or fossilized bone. It's believed that these sails, these elongated spines, and the skin that was stretched along these elongated neural spines, were very colorful, and most likely they were used for display purposes. For example, for courtship display. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we don't have the ability to see. We have to kind of imagine that through artistic imagination. But just think about an anolis lizard, and you guys have undoubtedly seen an anolis lizard with, with its gular, its very brightly colored, patterned gular fan that they display when they're displaying on their territory. And this is actually a Costa Rican anolis that I took a picture of, so it's something you probably saw with Doc on the lowlands trip. And so we have these, what we call the basal pelycosaurs. And again, these are kind of big lizard like things. And that then grades into the therapsids. And the therapsids are actually more in the southern hemisphere. These would have been fairly large bodied, not particularly attractive, some of them. This is a cow sized therapsid. This is a Labrador size, kind of looks like a mountain lion. And here's another dog sized therapsid. These were both carnivores and herbivores. They actually replaced the pelycosaurs. And we believe that it's this group, one particular group called the cynodonts, a group of therapsids that actually evolved into modern mammals. And so that's why we're going along this route. We know that they had endothermy. Okay, so they were able to generate internal heat. They had some kind of insulation, and they also had heterodonty, which meant that they had different kinds of teeth, specialized teeth, which we will discuss shortly. And so this particular one is terrier size. So just to give you a sense of what kind of size we're talking about. So again, not huge, T-Rex size at all. However, this one is actually cow size, so they could get a decent size. And here's some more other pictures. As you can see, some of these guys, some of these therapsids, really, face that only a mother could love. But that's what they look like. We think this is an artist's rendition. Okay, and then we go on to the archaic mammals. So we had the pelycosaurs going on to the the therapsids and specifically the cynodont branch. And now we're going to archaic mammals. So we're starting to see animals that look a lot more like the mammals that we know and love right now. Okay, and so this is a picture of a basal cynodont therapsid, what we've just been talking about. But what we see is that we go into small mammals. They have fur. We know they have fur, and basically, if we ran across one, we would say, "Well, I don't know what species that is. I've never seen anything like that before, but that's a mammal." I think we would recognize these as mammals. And so here is another complicated cladogram. But again, we start with the Pelycosaurus. Again, 300 million years ago, going on to therapsids, maybe 150 million years ago. These guys had more of an upright posture. Again, they had the heterodont dentition, meaning they had specialized teeth, just like we do, canines and molars and incisors. And they had a partial secondary palate, which we'll talk about why that's important. So the cynodonts are the lineage of therapsids that go into the archaic mammals. And we then see in the cynodonts, they have a complete secondary palate. Uh, this basically enables the animal to eat while it's also breathing. So if you don't have that secondary palate, the oral cavity is used both for breathing and for eating. And that means if you're eating, the oral cavity is blocked and you can't breathe. So you have to kind of take a deep breath, gobble down your food and then take another breath if you don't have that secondary palate. The secondary palate allows you to breathe while you're feeding. So that is really an advance. They also had multi-cusped molar teeth, so more advanced heterodont teeth, and also reduced lumbar rib cage, which we'll talk about. And then we get into this whole group, which is technically known as the Mammalia formes, and that includes that group that we would now call mammals, as well as some different and extinct forms. And in this group, we see there is jaw articulation, very very specific kind of jaw articulation, which is really important to the ecological success of mammals. Diphyodont dentition, meaning that we have milk teeth, uh, we have juvenile teeth, and then we have adult teeth, and then molars with two roots. So just to give you an idea that there's kind of slowly but surely there are improvements and a progress, an evolutionary progress. We also see that there's a miniaturization that happens, that the cynodonts that became the earliest mammals actually became smaller and smaller. Uh, we don't really know why. Very likely this was occurring at the time of the really big dinosaurs, and so it may be that the best way for them to survive and thrive was to become small, inconspicuous, and also to become more active at night, whereas the dinosaurs were big, dominant, and active during the day. So it was a way to separate their niches. Okay, so remember we have the pelycosaurs around the time of the Permian, 250 years ago. They go out, they're replaced by the therapsids, which are pretty much at the same time as the dinosaurs, the Triassic and the Jurassic. They go out in the Cretaceous about 145 million years ago. Archaic mammals are appearing at the same time as the cynodonts, and then we start to see placental and marsupial mammals, which are mammals that are still around, and but they are more primitive in some respects, and they're appearing right before the extinction of the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous period. Okay, and then we have the age of mammals. Already talked about that. As we start to see all the modern uh, clades, meaning orders, families, genera, species, come into being. So this is an early Jurassic mammal, and what you can see from the illustration is it does have fur. This would have been, it looks large, but this actually would have been shrew size, so pretty small. Uh, here's a bottle top for comparison. So we're talking about small animals. The earliest mammals were quite small. Here's another one. This is called Meotherium. It was about the size of a chipmunk. And so this is and there is a a can of soda for comparison. Lived about 123 million years ago. So during the time at the very same time as the dinosaurs, but again active really mostly at night. Here's another early Jurassic mammal, uh, Gaviconodon. You can see it's got fur, it's got teeth, it's got something we'll talk about again. That's the pinna. That's an external ear. It's kind of like a megaphone to capture a sound. You don't see that in other vertebrates, so that's pretty cool. There it is. Yeah. And then here's a couple other pictures. I always like to show pictures, but you can see these are small mammals, very early mammals, archaic mammals, the size of shrews, which are very small, kind of mouse-like rats, really mouse size, smaller than mice. And you can see from the scale of these beetles, they're eating insects, that these are pretty small guys. So these are like mouse size, right? Morganucodon and Cuniotherium. And long story short, if you look at the archaic mammals, you start to see there's a whole guild of different mammals that start to look like a lot of modern mammals, kind of have the same, you could call it the same kind of lifestyle. So, flying squirrel types, and fox types, and chipmunk types, and otter types. These are not modern, but they are getting towards there. Now, what's really interesting is to say, well, okay, so mammals are coming on, but why? What was different from mammals compared with the other reptiles and the earlier therapsids and conodonts cyanodonts rather, that occurred um, contemporaneously or before them? Why, what made them stick out? What made them distinct? And so we're going to go through these different kind of advances. We've got mammary glands, and of course that enabled mammals, females, to be able to give their young a complete nutritional package. There's hair for insulation, so endothermy, basically maintaining a constant body temperature. Uh, Other special glands, which we'll talk about: sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and musk glands, specialized teeth, that heterodonty we talked about. All these are advances in basically eating. Modifications of the skin, for example, for running, for locomotion, for defense, that kind of thing. And then, most importantly, an advanced brain. Basically, we're talking about animals that now are sneakier and more clever and just have more brain power. So we talk about hair. Yeah, so this is Chewbacca, just to illustrate that, yeah, hair is a really big advance. And we don't see hair as we would describe it in any other group of vertebrates, right? We see scales on reptiles, we see feathers and plumage on birds, but we only see hair on mammals. So that's unique. And in fact, we can see hair in some fossils. China's in the Liaoning province of China, there is some fantastic, very well defined fossils of not just mammals, other vertebrates. But you can see here is a mammal, 125 million years old. So we're talking about the age of the dinosaurs, where dinosaurs were dominant, and you can see this kind of blackened area in this very finely preserved fossil that is fur. Basically, this animal had fur, and it had fur 125 million years ago. Okay, what else do we have that would point to some advantages of mammals over the reptiles that basically were some of their major competitors? Well, one of them is jaw articulation, so the way the jaw works. And it turns out that there are 101 different ways for jaws to articulate. Okay, um, we the jawed vertebrates go all the way back, 500, 400 million years ago. But the way that works, differed and evolved. And in mammals, it evolved into a system where you've got a mandible that is basically articulating uh, with the skull, the rest of the skull, and you've got two major muscle groups, which are involved in in basically opening and closing the uh, the jaw. So you've got the temporalis and the masseter muscle. And the way that works happens to be very elegant and very efficient. We've also got three bones in the middle ear for more advanced hearing. So some of the bones that were actually used for jaw articulation in reptiles, in other vertebrates, actually became miniaturized in the course of evolutionary change and became part of the inner ear. So we've got advanced hearing, complex teeth for being able to, uh, to make basically to eat your prey little by little rather than having to swallow the whole animal. You can reduce its size and very specialized teeth, as we mentioned, incisors and canines, uh, premolars and molars. Hair, what we talked about, a four-chambered heart for efficient cardiovascular function, advanced homeostasis. So here we're talking about the ability to generate internal heat and maintain a constant body temperature through endothermy, an advanced secondary palate so you can breathe and eat at the same time, internal development so that the young are actually developing within the body of the female, within the uterus, within the placenta, and then sneaky behavior, as we mentioned before, more advanced mental and cognitive abilities through an enlarged and more sophisticated brain. So that's what we're talking about here. Let's talk about jaw musculature very quickly. This developed over a period of time, and this is just showing, I won't go into great detail here, but how the musculature changed to become more efficient. We see that in the course of this period of time, we have larger jaw muscles, uh, and you can see that right here that, for example, this muscle here becomes relatively larger. We've got temporalis, zygomatic arch, masseter muscle. This would be more important to you if we were doing the skull lab, because that's one of the things we go through, but we're not going to do that this time. Uh, and then the evolution of a muscular diaphragm, which is really important for respiration, right? The diaphragm is what compresses the lungs so that you can exhale and relaxes and enlarges the lungs so you can inhale. So that's super important. You can't do that if you've got a rib cage protecting your entire body. That kind of is like having a suit of armor on you. So what we see is we go from the pelycosaurs up here that had that went all the way back to the hind legs, and then we go to an early mammal, and you can see the rib cage only goes about halfway down, and same here. And what that means is that now you can have a diaphragm that's involved in the respiratory process, in what we call the tidal flow, breathing in and breathing out, inhalation and exhalation, inhalation, exhalation. Turns out that that's a pretty cool process. So we go from a complete rib cage all the way down to the tail to only a partial rib cage that allows for this muscular diaphragm and more advanced respiration. I already talked a little bit about the hard palate, but here's a picture to help you see. So if you're an animal that doesn't have a hard palate, look at this. This is the tongue. This is the nostrils. This is the skull, the brain, and this is where this is a larynx where your air is going into the lungs, and this is the esophagus where the food is going into. So if you don't have a hard palate, that means that your food and your air are going through the same passage, and that's tricky. As I said, you can't breathe and eat at the same time. Now, if you have a secondary palate, and that's what this kind of red area is, it divides up the top of the oral cavity and the bottom of the oral cavity so that you can put food into the bottom of the oral cavity, and you can breathe through the top of the oral cavity. So the ability to eat and breathe at the same time, uh, We see that development of a hard palate is going to enable that to happen by separating the airway, the air, the intake part of the oral cavity with the food intake part of the oral cavity. Something else that's kind of interesting is that we do see an evolution of facial musculature. So you might ask the question, why is it that snakes don't smile? Lizards don't smile. Well, they don't have the musculature. They can't. So you just do not see a change in the facial expression of a snake or a lizard simply because they have not evolved the musculature for changing their expression. But we start to see that in mammals, and you can see that in rodents, and you can see that especially in primates who communicate a lot through their facial expressions. But why did this happen? Well, it happened because mammals have mammary glands. Therefore, females nurse their young. And in order for young to get this mother's milk, from the teat of the female, they have to suckle. They have to be able to have the musculature to use their mouth to suckle. And so that is part of the reason, and all this musculature is in part a side effect of that suckling, that need for to be able to suckle with the lips. And you can see that right there. And then finally, we talked about larger brains, and we do see, of course, in this picture, we've got a smaller animal, small brain, larger animal, large brain, but we do see a proportionately larger brain as we go on in time. And we can, for example, see that mammals as well as birds uh, both have larger brains than other vertebrates, meaning reptiles, amphibians, and fish. So, for example, this would be the mammals. Whoops, go back here. This would be the mammals. So this is we're talking about. This is a logarithmic scale, log scale. So this is the brain mass, uh, which is displayed against the body mass. And so as the body mass goes up, of course, the brain mass goes up. But note that the brain mass goes up faster than it does in mammals than it does for these other groups of vertebrates. So that's super important to remember. The other thing is that there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is actually enlarged in mammals. It's larger in mammals than in other vertebrates. It's also larger in some mammals than other mammals. Uh, why do we care about the prefrontal cortex? Well, this is basically the center for learning, for planning, for memory, for abstract reasoning, all those things that we tend to associate with intelligence, what I described as, quote, sneaky behavior. And so if you look at a rat, yeah, not really much in the way of prefrontal cortex. If you look at a primate as a prosimian, like a bush baby, it's got just a little bit of a prefrontal. You start looking at a more advanced primate, a larger prefrontal, and you look at the great apes and the more advanced, you get quite a significantly large prefrontal cortex. So the ability to remember, to learn, to plan, to reason, all that, those cognitive abilities go along with the enlarged prefrontal cortex. All right. So again, this is an archaic mammal. You can see its mouse size is basically feeding on invertebrates, on insects, and although this picture is deceptive, these guys would have been mostly active at night. Okay, so let's go back to a simplified cladogram or evolutionary tree. And note that we start at the base 360 million years ago with the amniotes. Okay, so these are the animals that have a shelled egg. So reptiles, basically. And then we have two groups. One group's called the diapsids, means they have two holes in their skull, and they go off to birds and reptiles. And the other, the synapsids, as we've talked about, which means they have a single hole, they go off to mammal like reptiles, they go off to primitive mammals, and then they go off to actually three different groups of mammals. And those are the placental sorry, those are the monotremes, which are the most primitive, as well as the marsupials and the placental mammals. And so that's what we want to talk about next is that division of mammals as they evolved about 150 million years ago and going forward, especially 65 million years ago after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So that is what we want to look at, kind of this division into these three groups of monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. And don't worry too much about the names. I'll say it a few times. So again, let's review. We've got the extinct proto-mammals, okay? The wannabe mammals. They're not mammals yet, but they're on the road to being mammals. The pelycosaurs, therapsids, the cynodont therapsids. And then we have the Mammaliaformes, and these are basically, there's some extinct groups, but it's primarily the current mammals that we see in those three different groups I talked about. There's also a group called the multi-tuberculates, which are not around. So that's an extinct group that we're not going to talk about. But then we have the monotremes, and then what are called the therians. Again, I'll talk about and unpack that terminology, and it's not absolutely essential that remember all these terms, but I want you to understand as well as we can in this pretty quick little lecture of what we're talking about. So and this is a little picture of a multi-tuberculate having lunch while a pterosaur flies by. So you can see that even at the time of pterosaurs weren't dinosaurs, but they were at the same time as dinosaurs, that these mammaliaformes, these mammals, early mammals, archaic mammals, really did look like mammals, small nocturnal mammals. These multituberculates, by the way, they were rodent-like, and they actually may have been driven extinct by the actual rodents. Uh, okay, so moving on to the extant mammals. So the mammals that we can still see around the world today. We have a very simplified cladogram. We've got the monotremes, which make up the prototherians, the marsupials make up the metatherians, and the placentals make up the eutherians. And I apologize for all this terminology, but we do have, when we look at a cladogram, what's called a stem clade. So prototheria is the um, is you might think of it as the pathway that this group took over time. So it includes extinct or archaic versions. And then the crown clade is simply what we see now today. This is what's in the world right now. You can go out and see a monotreme that's in this crown clade, but the prototherians may be extinct. Same thing here, metatherians leading to the marsupials, talk about those, and then eutherian lineage leading to all the other mammals, which we call the placentalia, the placentals. And the metatherians and eutherians, which lead to the marsupials and placental mammals, are what's called the therians, theria. So again, lots of terminology, don't worry too much about it. Let's talk about the prototheria or monotremes. Monotremes are they're known as the most primitive of the mammals, um, and there actually aren't a whole lot of them around. There's only about 5 species, and they consist of two different types: the duck-billed platypus, which you've probably heard about, and something known as an echidna or spiny anteater. And what is distinctive about these mammals is that they actually lay eggs. They have a very limited internal development. So in other words, the eggs develop inside the females. They hatch the eggs. So the eggs then develop outside the reproductive tract. The eggs have a very large yolk, which is the nutrients for the developing embryo. And just like birds, these mammals have females have ovaries that are much larger because they're developing a large egg. But these do qualify as mammals. Why? Because they've got hair. They're endotherms, so they're basically what we would call warm-blooded, although that's not a good technical term. Warm-blooded meaning that they maintain a constant temperature based on internally generated metabolic heat. They produce milk. You'll see they do it in a slightly different way. They do not have teeth, and this probably is a little bit of the result, a relic of the fact that the species that have survived didn't need teeth. So there were probably earlier monotremes that did have teeth. They lost it in these groups that have survived today. Again, only 5 species. Who are these? Who are these characters? Well, we've got the duck-billed platypus. There's only one species of duck-billed platypus, and where is he? There he is, right there. Okay. By the way, I am told that the proper plural to platypus is platypodes as opposed to platypuses. So, that's a fun fact there. And then 4 species of echidnas or spiny anteaters, and you can see they're basically the same model. They look like a little bit like porcupines, and crossed with an anteater, no teeth. Where are they? Well, all of the monotremes are found in Australia, and we believe that that's where they evolved, and they really never spread. And the reason for that is interesting, but we won't get into that. So that's the only place you're going to see uh, the monotremes or prototherians. What about parental care in the platypus? Well, they do have lactation, and so we do see females. By the way, this picture is a misnomer because Mr. Platypus, the father, probably wasn't hanging around with the mother, uh, but the female did produce milk and was able to feed her young with milk. But when we're talking about a platypus baby, we're talking about a very underdeveloped, almost fetus-like organism that is born very much like the marsupials, very small, very underdeveloped, and have to spend an extended period of time close to mother, protected by mother, and essentially constantly feeding to get big enough to develop fur, develop the brain and the sensory, the eyes, and all that. So you can see this is this is a very underdeveloped fetus-like baby, but you can see how small it is. Okay, so we have to now talk about the placenta because this is a really important part of the story. And what we see in marsupials is that, whoops, right here, marsupials up here, is that the the large over half, kind of the lion's share of and it's not technically called a placenta, but the egg for the marsupial and for the monotreme as well is actually made up of yolk sac. So there's a large nutrient base. So the basal amniotes, so for example, reptiles would have most of the egg in yolk sac because that is what is going to nourish the developing embryo until they're born. Remember, they're not able to nurse. They don't have lactation. We go to monotremes, and the yolk sac is actually a little bit smaller. The yolk sac actually is right here, and over here is where waste products are going. So the yolk sac is actually smaller, but still, a lot of the growth is happening in the egg, and then it hatches out, and then we have lactation. We'll look at what that looks like. Marsupials are very similar, very large yolk sac. They develop, but only to pretty much an embryonic stage. Then they're hatched out, or they're born, not in an egg. In the case of marsupials, and then they develop the rest of the way through mother's milk, through lactation. Then we look at the placental mammals, and the placental mammals, of course, don't have any egg. They really have a very, very reduced yolk sac. So the yolk sac is not really very much involved in nourishing the developing fetus at all. It's actually largely through nutrients that are coming through the placenta, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so again, basal amniotes leading to the monotremes, marsupials, and placentas right there. And the basal amniot, as I just described, mostly yolk sac. See how big it is. The monotreme, smaller yolk sac, but still, the yolk sac is the source of nutrients and the source of nourishments for that developing embryo until it's born. And so here we have a spiny echidna, a monotreme. Here we have a duck-billed platypus. And what I want you to notice is that the platypus and the echidna have an interesting structure. Uh, they actually have spurs, kind of claws, a little spur on their hind legs. And these spurs are actually connected to glands. Now, this is really interesting because we don't see this in any other mammal. It turns out that the platypus actually has a venom gland, which is connected to this spur. And so the platypus is actually able, for example, if it's fighting a competitor, it's able to stab a competitor with its spur and inject venom. So this is the uh, only venomous mammal that we know of. Uh, it turns out that the gland produces venom in the platypus. The gland is actually not functional in the echidnas, but the gland and the spur are still there. They're just not functional. Again, the platypus male uses the venom in male-male competition, and so this suggests that venom was once present in both, basically in all of this group of monotremes in both echidnas, uh, platypus as they are today, and other now extinct monotremes. So this is really interesting. The evolution of venom delivery in mammals. What we can see is it's a little bit complicated, but what we see is that way back when, maybe 200 million years ago, there was the appearance of a spur that could inject venom. And then in some groups, most groups, that spur and that venom gland were actually lost. And so the eutherians were lost, the metatherians were lost. So these are the marsupials as well as the placental mammals. Um, the venom gland became sexual dimorphic, only found in males in the monotremes, and then it was lost in the echidnas, but still found in the platypus. Okay. Now, what's interesting, see, do I have yeah, so it was lost in that group, lost in the echidnas, whoops, and present in the platypus. Uh, Now, it is so two take-home messages that there was a venom delivery system, excuse me, that was present in common ancestor of all mammals. And there actually is a kind of venom, but it's delivered by saliva as opposed to by a spur or a claw or a tooth. And that is in shrews. So they actually have a different kind of venom delivery, but only the platypus actually has a spur that can inject venom in mammals. Another fun fact is that these monotremes have a lot of sex chromosomes, 9 or 10 sex chromosomes. What that means or what the significance of that is unsure. But the point is that their genetics have actually, and their sex determination genetics in particular, have really changed between the monotremes and the therians, which we'll talk about next. So you can see monotremes, their sex chromosomes are XY, 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 whereas they're much more simplified. The rest of the mammals, the placentals, the marsupials have just an XY system. Of course, females have two X's, males have an X and a Y. A little bit different system for birds and reptiles, fish, and so forth. But that's what we're talking about there. Okay, so now we can also think about this. How are these primitive mammals, these monotremes, how do they remind us of other vertebrates? And it turns out that it is kind of an example of what's known as mosaic evolution, where you have different kinds of characteristics found in one organism. And so we can see that monotremes actually possess characters that remind us of a bunch of other animals. For example, like reptiles, they lay eggs. Like birds, they lay eggs. Like mammals, they are able to nurse their young. They have lactation. Like reptiles, in the case of the platypus, they actually can deliver venom. Uh, Also, and it's not illustrated here, but like fish, they also have electroreception, meaning that they can detect their prey through electrical currents, and that's actually what the uh, platypus does. Okay, the duckbill platypus actually swims underwater, and it has the ability to detect its prey through electrical current that's produced by its prey, and that's something that fish can do. Okay, so I'll let you look at this particular figure in greater detail, but it's just showing that this primitive duckbill platypus, this monotreme that is still around, has kind of a mosaic of different features. It's toothless. Its bill is rubbery, unlike birds. It's got webbed feet because it's aquatic. It lays eggs because it's a monotreme, just like birds. It's got a single anogenital system or opening for pee and poo and reproduction. It's got this venom delivery claw or spur on the back, but it's also got fur, and it's got some adaptations to being underwater, like the ability to close its eyes, ears, and nostrils when it's swimming. And it also has an electrosensory system for detecting animals through their electrical output. Okay, so that is a lot that we spent on these primitive monotremes, or prototherians, these primitive mammals, but they are so interesting because they're different and yet they're the same. Now the therians are all united by the fact that they all have a placenta. It's just that the what we call the placental mammals have a more advanced placenta, and those are the eutherians, or true therians, okay, and those would be most of the mammals. The metatherians, or otherwise known as the marsupials, also have a placenta. It doesn't work quite as well. So let's talk about the metatherians or marsupials quickly. We've got over 300 species, so quite a bit more than the monotremes, but quite a bit less than the so-called placental mammals. And if you think about neotropical mammals, we're primarily talking about opossums, right? And there's many species of opossums that we would find in the neotropics. Those are the only marsupials we would come across. In fact, in general, that's the marsupials that we'd all recognize are opossums in the New World. But if we go to the Old World, especially Australasia, which means Australia and that region, we see kangaroos and wallabies and all sorts of other marsupials. These guys have a primitive placenta, meaning that the young are supported for a certain amount of time during internal development, but then they pretty much have to be born. They run out of food. They have to be born essentially prematurely, as we saw in that picture of the young monotreme. It's very similar for the young marsupials. They're born in this pretty much embryonic state prematurely. So we do have live birth. They are viviparous, meaning they're born alive as opposed to born in an egg. But the gestation period is only maybe a couple weeks. Like I said, the young are born in an early embryonic stage, basically look like a jelly bean. Depends on the size of the adult. Kangaroos, the adult is human sized. So we have some kangaroos that are the size of a person, but the newborn is 2 to 3 centimeters long, so only about an inch long. And what happens is that the newborn actually, the where they're born is they actually crawl out of the female's vaginal opening, attached to a nipple if they can find one, and then they stay attached to that nipple until they're large enough to detach. Some of these animals have a marsupium, which is a pouch like kangaroos. A lot of them don't have a marsupium, but that pouch, the name of that pouch is what has given the name to this whole group. So they're all called marsupials, but they don't all have a marsupium. Where are they distributed? Well, again, they're distributed more widely than the monotremes. They're distributed in Australasia, in New Zealand, in uh, New Guinea, and so forth. And they're also distributed throughout the New World. So South America, There's a greater diversity in South America and then in North America. And um, we can talk about how that happened through continental drift and so forth. But they all ended up either in Australia or in the New World and not in the Old World at all. So here we have marsupials that evolve in Australia and that region. We've got wombats and kangaroos and bandicoots and native cats and Tasmanian wolves and all these different names that we've given to these different groups of marsupials in the old world, okay, in essentially the Australia region. And then we have primarily opossums uh, that have been able to take hold and uh, to come into South America and the New World in general. And this, of course, happened because of continental drift. That all the continents, as we know them now, were once all together. And so, for example, we would have Australia here would have been connected to Antarctica, would have been connected to India, would have connected to Africa, and would have connected to South America. And so this is presumably how the opossums of the marsupial group got over to South America. Now, why aren't there any marsupials in Africa? You may ask. Good question. That is a great question. Don't know. Okay, let's talk about the evolution of the placenta. Um, Already talked about this a little bit, but in marsupials, remember we have this reduced egg yolk, which is used to nourish the developing embryo. And basically, once the egg yolk is used up, once all the nourishment from the egg yolk has been exhausted, then that embryo is born. And as I said, it's born in a very premature embryonic like state. It is able to survive as long as it can get mother's milk. This is known as the choriovitelline, uh, or unofficially as a yolk sac placenta that's found in marsupials. Don't worry about those names. You don't have to know those names. But again, you have a placenta in which the major feature is this very large yolk sac. What do the young look like in marsupials? Well, this is a young being born right here. It's a peanut size. This is actually a gray kangaroo or a wallaby. I'm not sure what kangaroo or wallaby, and you can see it's being born. It's emerging from the birth canal, and it is literally the size of a peanut, so embryonic in size. There is so that basically no legs, no limbs. Basically, what it has is it's got a mouth and it's got lips that can suckle, that can grip on to the teat of the female. By the way, I didn't mention this, but in monotremes, monotremes do not have teats, but they do have the mammary gland. So what happens in the monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus and the echidna, is that when the female feeds, the milk is just exuded through the skin and onto the fur, and the young kind of lap up the milk from the skin and the fur. In the case of marsupials and placental mammals, there's actually a teat, which is essentially like a hose or a way to directly feed the young. And so basically, this little baby kangaroo, which is just a kind of a peanut size uh, embryonic stage young animal, is in very large part one massive mouth with lips that can attach to the teat and suckle until they're big enough. Bandicoots have multiple, give birth to multiple youngs, and you can see they're all connected by the embryonic cord. Kangaroo, yeah. Kangaroos are really interesting. They're interesting because a female can actually have young in three different stages. They can have young that are in this embryonic stage. They can have young that are a little bit older that are riding in the marsupium, that pouch, and they have young that are actually independent. They don't have to live in the pouch anymore. As you can see, it wouldn't fit, but they're able to come back to the milk bar and suckle from the female from time to time to get a little bit of extra extra nutrients. And so that's kind of illustrated in this figure here, where we've got at the same exact time, a female might have a joey, that's the young, this kind of peanut-sized embryonic premature uh, a baby, joey. It's suckling on a teat. At the same time, it has a joey that is now independent that comes back to the milk par to suckle when it's hungry. And at the same time, she's also got a developing embryo, but it's in what's known as embryonic diapause. And so, in other words, that whole developmental process has been stopped, has been paused until she's able to give birth to another young, basically until this joey is old enough, and then this one can be born and attached to the teat. And so females basically are giving birth and developing multiple stages of young at the same time. Okay, finally, let's talk about the eutherians, true therians, otherwise known as the placental mammals. 95% of the mammals fall into this category, over 4,200 species, and their main claim to fame is they have an advanced placenta. The embryo is develops entirely internally and is nourished during this whole time by the mother's nutrition through the placenta. As a result of that, the young are not born as little peanut-sized, embryonic little worm peanut-sized things, but they're born in a more advanced state. We have some species that are precocial that are actually able to get up and start running, within a half hour of being born. And the evolutionary advantage of this is that it produces superior young that are more likely to survive than a peanut. It also enables them during this period of time to learn complex behaviors, for example, through what we call play behavior, which is basically just kind of testing the waters, uh, trying out different kinds of movement and behavior that might be used later on as an adult. However, this means that plus the female in plus these species pay a very high cost in maternal care because they're not only doing this gestation thing where they're developing their young internally based on their own nutrition, but once the young are born, they're still continuing to feed the young now outside of the womb, but nursing. Uh, the lactation that's occurring through the mammary glands, and so there's a immense cost to the female in these placental mammals in terms of maternal care. Okay, so this is just showing a placenta, just showing here we have the embryo in here, we have the amniotic sac, we've got various blood vessels, and there's a yolk sac. And you can see the yolk sac is very small. This young animal is not dependent on the yolk sac for nourishment. It's actually coming from the female. And you guys probably already know this, but basically we've got the placenta has these very fine blood vessels that are basically interdigitated with maternal tissue. So the placental tissue um, is actually a conduit for food from the mother to go across this placental membrane to the embryo that's developing to feed the embryo. And likewise, waste products from the embryo are passed through the placenta and excreted by the female. So there's just a bigger version of this. Again, very small yolk sac, amniotic cavity with amniotic fluid, uh, where the embryo is kind of floating and swimming around. And then through these very fine blood vessels uh, with the maternal tissue, we have the passage of nourishment as well as the exit of waste products. We've got the what's known as a chorioallantoic placenta, and that's really important. And all that means is that we've got maternal blood vessels, veins, and arteries that are coming into very close contact with the arteries and veins of the developing placenta. They're not actually touching or connected, but they're so close that the blood flow, the flow of of nourishment, of food, and of waste products can pass between the both the embryonic and the maternal blood streams. There you go. Of course, you've got two different kinds of development, I guess, in these placental mammals. Some are what are known as altricial, meaning that they're born in a very undeveloped and helpless stage. So they're almost like those marsupial peanut-sized little, embryonic size young. So here's a field mice, and you can see they're blind. They can hardly move. They can wriggle around. They're really not. They don't have fur. They can't survive outside of the nest and without the nourishment of the young. And then you have a precocial that is a very fast developing placental like a deer, which typically within a half hour are able to stand up, and some species are able to move around and even to run within a half hour or an hour. And I've seen this many times when I've observed antelope, I've observed deer, I've observed bison, and so forth. So, just to give you a broader picture, who are the precocial young? Well, they'd be the ungulates like the deer. Actually, whales and primates are also very precocial. Altricial, born very helpless state. These would be the rodents, insectivores, and many carnivores. So think of cats and dogs. Uh, but the advantage is that the altricial can have more young. So they tend to have larger litters, but probably the survival is not going to be as great because they're born in such a helpless state. The other thing is that these eutherian mammals, compared with the marsupials and the monotremes, uh, it could be argued that they can produce more high quality young, but it does cost a lot in terms of gestation and lactation. And of course, the other thing that we see is that the number of teats on a female also predicts how many young they're able to nurse, and so how big the litter can be. And so, for example, this fox, this canid, we can see there's a whole bunch of young, uh, compared to, let's say, a primate that may only give birth to one single young. Okay, one last thing I want to do. I know there's been a kind of a, a, a hose pipe of information coming out here. Let's just look quickly at the different major groups of the placental mammals. Again, over 4,200 species. And by the way, new species being discovered every year still. And we've got insectivores and bats, rodents, ungulates, cetaceans, carnivores, and primates. And let me just say that this whole taxonomy, right? This whole organization has actually changed in the last decade. It's actually more complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say here is the old system, because the old system I think you're going to understand better. If you want to know what the new system is, it's a lot more complicated, but it's still the same idea. When we look at the number of species within Mammalia, and especially within Theria, okay, Eutheria, the placental mammals, we see that most of them are rodents or bats, Rodentia and Chiroptera. We've got, about 63%, almost two-thirds of them are rodents and bats. So we can see that rodents and bats have been very successful, and they really have proliferated and diversified to an extent not seen in any of the other groups. And then we have moles and shrews, we have primates, carnivores, we've got the even-toed, ungulates, and a whole bunch of others. What are these major groups? Well, let me just talk quickly. The insectivora are, as you might guess, they eat insects, so that's why they're called the insectivora. But they include things like shrews, which are very small. They're actually not rodents, but they're reminiscent of rodents, very small. Hedgehogs, moles. That's a mole that are living underground and eating worms and that kind of thing. Tenrec is an old world species as well. So these are insectivora. Bats, as I mentioned, one of the two groups that is extremely species rich. Um, in Costa Rica, it happens that there are more species of bats than rodents, but worldwide, there are more rodents than bats. But in the neotropics, bats rule, bats predominate. There's two kinds of bats, what we might call the microbats or microchiroptera. Chiroptera is the order of bats. And then fruit bats or megachiroptera. So small bats, larger bats. What we see in the New World are the Microchiroptera. In the Old World, we also have the Megachiroptera. So here's a fruit bat. You can see this looks more like a rodent. It's got pretty big teeth, pretty big eyes. It actually uses its eyes visually. Um, and there's another one there. And the microbats are primarily nocturnal and are primarily using echolocation rather than visual location to maneuver. Rodents, as I mentioned, worldwide, this is the most numerous, diverse species, and there's quite a diversity. We've got a number that are nocturnal, but also a significant number that are diurnal, active both day and night. We've got rats and mice. We've got hamsters. We've got squirrels like this guy here. We've got porcupines. We've got marmots, beavers, the apaca and the agouti, which you're already familiar with. This is a capybara. This is the largest rodent in the world. Um, we've got this is a marmot, mouse, of course, prairie dog, or basically a large ground squirrel. Carnivora, the very diverse group, actually. We've got our familiar canids like wolves and foxes. We've got the felids, so that would be your jaguars and pumas and cheetahs. We've got, of course, bears. We've also got weasels like the tyra, hyenas and civets, which are found in the Old World in Africa, for example, raccoons, which are found all over the place, pinnipeds, seals, marine mammals. So it includes a huge group. We've got the cetacea, which are, of course, whales and dolphins, very large group. And by the way, related to the ungulates. And then primates, which are almost, except for Homo sapiens, they're just pretty much all threatened in one way or the other. We've got prosimians, which are the more, uh, we could call them more primitive. We've got the monkeys and we've got the apes. And of course, there's four species in Costa Rica of primates, going from the spider monkey, which I don't know if you've seen them, the white-faced capuchin, which I'm sure you've seen, the spider monkey and the howler monkey. Hopefully, you saw those as well. And then the ungulata, this would be the hoofed mammal. So the ungulate is the technical term for that hoof. And there's two flavors of ungulata. There's the artiodactyla, which are the even-toed ungulates, which is the greatest diversity. So there we have cattle and deer and hippos and sheep and goats and pigs. Basically, most of the hoofed mammals. The perissodactyls are the odd-toed, and so that would be the horses and the donkeys and the zebras. Um, but it also includes two really interesting groups, one of which is the rhinos, and the other is the tapir. So tapirs are actually even-toed ungulates or perissodactyls. And both rhinos and tapirs have three distinct toes that you can see in their tracks. Of course, horses and asses and donkeys have one. So this is showing that. Um, just a second. Um, we've got perissodactyl, which has got either one toe or three toes. And we can see that in the horse, or the three toes in the tapir and the rhino, and the artiodactyl, which tends to have two toes. And so that's it. There's been some changes in time, but that is as far as I'm going to go with the major groups of the eutherians. So I hope that's helpful. Goodbye.